Just a nurse, Dr. Pierce said, not looking up from his tablet as Megan O'Brien passed the third-floor nursing station. He didn't say it to her. He said it to the resident beside him, the words landing like a dismissal, like she was furniture that happened to move. They always think they see something the first week. Megan kept walking. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, that particular hospital frequency that sounds like 10,000 machines breathing at once. Her oversized scrubs, deliberately oversized, collar hanging loose, hem cuffed twice at the ankles, made her disappear into the beige linoleum and institutional blue. That was intentional. St. Michael's Medical Center sprawls across 12 blocks of downtown San Antonio, all concrete corridors and antiseptic that never quite masks the smell of burnt coffee from the break rooms. Megan had been working the ICU night shift for 8 months, ever since Captain James Morrison, her son's commanding officer, the man who walked out of forward operating base Shank with blood on his boots and 3 of his Marines still in a Hindu Kush valley, had arrived in a medical transport with injuries that didn't match his official report. She'd been waiting for him. Watching. Waiting for someone to ask the questions he wouldn't. The morning she started, Megan had arrived at St. Michael's at 5:53 a.m., 17 minutes before her shift began, and walked straight to the ICU locker room without stopping at the credential desk or the HR office or anywhere anyone might look at her twice. She'd changed into scrubs that hung on her frame like borrowed skin, tied her dark hair back so tight it pulled her temples, and moved through the hospital like a woman who'd already apologized for taking up space. Hand steady. Breathing controlled. The kind of invisible that only comes from deliberate practice. The faded unit patch, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, was sewn into the lining of her civilian jacket, stitched by her own hands in a motel room in Albuquerque. She touched it each morning before she clocked in. A ritual. A reminder. A promise to a boy she'd left in someone else's care. On her right hand, a simple brushed steel military ring. Never removed. She turned it absently during downtime, the metal worn smooth by 18 years of rotation. Nobody at St. Michael's knew what it meant. Nobody had asked. The first code she'd witnessed had been for weeks into the job. A 63-year-old male admitted with septic shock, blood pressure cratering, the alarms screaming their electronic panic. The attending physician had frozen for exactly 2.4 seconds, she'd counted, and the resident had started shouting orders that contradicted each other. Megan had moved without permission, without speaking, her hands reaching for the 18-gauge angiocath needle with the kind of certainty that made the charge nurse step back. 2 punctures. Both successful. For fluids running wide open. Lactated ringers, 500 milliliters per minute. The attending had glared at her like she'd committed a crime. She hadn't flinched. Dr. Pierce had been present for that code. He'd stood in the doorway, expensive shoes, Italian leather, probably $800, planted shoulder-width apart, and watched her work with an expression that cycled from surprise to contempt in the space of 4 heartbeats. When the patient stabilized, when the monitor settled into sinus rhythm, Pierce had walked out without a word. The resident later said, "You shouldn't have done that without being asked," but his voice had no conviction. He'd watched her hands the same way the attending had. That was the moment Megan understood what she was up against. Dr. Pierce was not a stupid man, which made him dangerous in a different way than stupid men are dangerous. Stupid men are predictable. Intelligent men who've built careers on manipulation and financial shortcuts are architects of their own power. He'd been Chief of Surgical Services for 9 years. Before that, he'd been Regional VP of Medical Operations for a private hospital conglomerate in Dallas. He had the kind of confidence that came from never being questioned by anyone who had institutional standing to make it stick. He also had the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly which board members received kickback payments from the medical suppliers he contracted with. Megan knew this because 3 days before she'd walked into St. Michael's with oversized scrubs and a borrowed identity, she'd read the classified briefing. 18 pages. 7 redacted names. 1 clear directive: monitor Colonel James Morrison's recovery. Document any inconsistencies between his reported injuries and actual surgical findings. Report directly to the Pentagon Joint Special Operations Command Liaison. Maintain operational security absolute. What the briefing hadn't said, but what Megan knew from 23 years in the military, was why Morrison had survived an ambush that killed 3 soldiers under his command. 2 of them were her son's closest friends. The official report claimed the ambush occurred at grid reference 34.7 degrees north, 69.2 degrees east. The classified briefing said the actual location was 47 kilometers southeast, in a zone where no American operations were supposed to occur. Someone had sent Morrison into hostile territory without authorization. Someone with access to operational details at the Joint Task Force level. And that someone, apparently, had also made sure Morrison's recovery at St. Michael's would be handled with very specific medical protocols. Colonel Morrison had arrived on a Thursday evening, transferred from Brooke Army Medical Center in San Antonio's Joint Base, just across town, just far enough that he could have civilian care if necessary. His chart showed injuries consistent with an IED blast, 2nd and 3rd degree burns on his left side, penetrating trauma to the left thorax, fractured left humerus, significant tissue damage requiring immediate surgical intervention. The operative report listed a left anterolateral thoracotomy, primary closure of the left pulmonary artery, drainage of hemothorax, and removal of fragmented rib bone. The bill came to $87,000. Not including medications, supplies, or facility fees. Megan had read the operative report at 2:17 a.m., during her 4th shift, while Morrison slept with morphine in his feline and ventilator tubes down his throat. She'd compared it against the actual equipment logs. She'd photographed the surgical tray manifests with her phone, a burner, untraceable, purchased at a Walmart in Groon. She'd noted the discrepancies in neat handwriting on a blank piece of paper that she would burn in her apartment's fireplace later. The hospital's records showed that Dr. Pierce had personally selected the surgical team. Pierce had supervised the procurement of materials. Pierce had signed off on the wound closure method and materials. And the surgical supplies that had actually been opened and used, the sutures, the hemostatic agents, the chest tube, were not the high-grade materials that appeared on the billing codes. Pierce had billed for military-grade surgical materials and used pharmacy-grade substitutes. The difference in cost was approximately $23,000 per procedure. Morrison was his 4th such case in 18 months. The 3rd shift of Megan's 2nd week, she'd found Morrison awake at 3:42 a.m., pain medication wearing off, his left side rigid and splintered. His eyes tracked her as she entered the room, military instinct, threat assessment, the kind of automatic scanning that didn't turn off just because you were in a hospital bed. She'd checked his vitals without speaking, her movements efficient, the way she moved through all her work. Invisible. Professional. Just another night nurse. She'd been turning to leave when Morrison had whispered, "You move like a soldier." Megan had paused. Her hand on the forestand. Her breathing exactly normal. "You hold your shoulders wrong to be just a nurse," Morrison had continued, his voice rough from the ventilator. "Left side guards the wound. Right hand ready. Eyes up. That's not civilian nursing." She'd looked at him then, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. Some recognitions require no introduction. "Sleep, Colonel," she'd said. "Doctor's orders." He'd closed his eyes. When she'd left the room, she'd known he understood. He'd known someone was here for him. He just didn't know why. That had been 10 days ago. Dr. Pierce had begun his evening rounds at 7:15 p.m., moving through the ICU with the deliberate air of a man who believed the hospital belonged to him because, in a meaningful sense, it did. He wore a white coat over surgical scrubs, an affectation Megan had noted, since he almost never actually operated anymore, and he carried an iPad that displayed patient vitals, charts, and whatever else he decided to pull up. His shoes clicked on the linoleum like a metronome counting toward something. He stopped at Morrison's room, tablet in hand, and frowned at the numbers displayed on the monitor. Megan was reviewing Morrison's post-operative imaging in the charting station 40 feet away, but she could see Pierce's expression shift. Not concern. Calculation. The room went dead quiet except for the ventilator wheeze and the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. Megan felt the weight of the moment settle across her shoulders like sandbags. Pierce turned from Morrison's door and walked directly toward the nursing station. He didn't acknowledge her immediately. He stopped at the desk and began speaking to the charge nurse, Sandra, in a voice low enough that he probably thought Megan couldn't hear. But Megan's hearing, like everything else about her, had been trained for 18 years to pick up conversations across rooms. "I want additional labs drawn on Colonel Morrison," Pierce was saying. "Complete metabolic panel, PT-INR, CBC with differential. And I want them run immediately, not batched. He's showing signs of infection." Sandra glanced at the monitor display. "His white count's at 12,000. That's normal post-operative." "I want them run," Pierce repeated, and there was something in his tone that made Sandra nod immediately. "And increase his Cipro dosage to 500 milligrams twice daily." The original protocol was insufficient. Megan kept her eyes on the computer screen in front of her. The medication order was unnecessary. Morrison's white count was, in fact, completely normal for a patient 3 weeks post-surgery. The Cipro increase was also unnecessary, and potentially dangerous given his renal function numbers. But she understood now what Pierce was doing. He was documenting. Creating a paper trail that showed medical reasons for extended hospitalization, additional procedures, more medication protocols. More billable hours. She turned the military ring on her right hand. Once. Twice. 3 times. The metal was warm from her skin. "Megan," Pierce said, and she turned slowly to face him. "I need you to coordinate those labs. We're looking at a potentially compromised surgical site." "Yes, doctor," she said, her voice exactly level, exactly deferential. The voice she'd worn for the past 8 months like a second skin. He studied her for a moment, the way a man might study a piece of furniture he'd never quite noticed before. She'd practiced this look in mirrors for weeks. Empty. Attentive. Professional. Nobody there. "How long have you been with us?" he asked. 8 months, sir." "And before that?" "Private sector nursing." Nothing relevant. It was a lie that had survived every background check because the people running the background checks worked for the Pentagon. They knew who she was. They knew what she was doing here. They just weren't the kind of people who asked official questions about operational security. "Well," Pierce said, "see that you stick to what you know. Patient care. Don't get ambitious. That's how nurses make mistakes." He walked away before she could respond. His shoes clicked toward the next room. The next patient. The next opportunity to bill for procedures that didn't require them. Megan returned her attention to the computer screen, but her mind was already 3 steps ahead. Morrison would be fine, his surgical site was healing normally, his infection markers were stable, his oxygen saturation was exactly where it should be at 97% on minimal support. But Pierce had just given her something more valuable than a diagnosis. He'd given her a window. The next words out of his mouth would change everything. And she would be ready. Dr. Pierce's voice cut through the ICU like a blade. "Nurse O'Brien. My office. Now." He stood in Colonel Morrison's doorway, his posture rigid, deliberately theatrical in the slowness of how he pulled the door shut behind them both. Through the glass partition, Megan could see Morrison's wife leaning forward in her chair. Their daughter, mid-20s, uniform creases suggesting her own military service, had already noticed something was wrong. The door clicked. Air pressure changed. "Can you explain?" Pierce began, his tone dropping into that register doctors used when they were about to humiliate someone. "Why you questioned my post-operative antibiotic protocol in front of the day shift?" He didn't sit. He stood at the head of the conference table with his arms crossed, a man positioning himself above her literally and theatrically. "I never questioned," Megan started. "Don't interrupt me, clipboard." The nickname landed exactly where he'd aimed it. Sharp. Diminishing. A weapon dressed in casual dismissal. Your job is to follow orders, not practice medicine. You're a task completer, not a decision maker. The fact that you think your opinion matters here shows a fundamental misunderstanding of the hierarchy. You chart vitals. You change dressings. You keep your observations to yourself and let physicians think. He leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. Do you understand the distinction, clipboard? The room had that particular silence that comes before storms. Megan's face went flat. Not angry. Not hurt. Blank as a slate wiped clean by someone who had spent years watching her emotions become liabilities in desert tents and combat zones. She met his gaze with the kind of stare that makes predators go still, not the trembling anger of someone wounded, but the terrifying composure of someone who had already calculated 12 different ways this encounter could end. Her hand stayed loose at her sides. Her breathing didn't change. When he finished speaking, she didn't apologize. Didn't flinch. Didn't defend herself. Instead, she said in a voice so level it sounded like concrete being poured, I documented exactly what you ordered, doctor. Every unnecessary test. Every inflated procedure code. The supply requisitions. The billing records. Medicare will find that absolutely fascinating. She turned toward the door. Her right hand caught the doorframe, and the ring on her fourth finger, a simple band of worn military-grade titanium, caught the fluorescent light and threw it back like a mirror. Pierce's face went white-knuckled, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. She didn't wait for his response. She was already walking. 2 days later, Megan sat in the break room with a turkey sandwich and a patient chart. Teresa from day shift took one look at her, muttered something about forgotten paperwork, and evacuated. Mark grabbed his coffee without making eye contact, the kind of deliberate coldness that had nothing to do with caffeine. By Wednesday, the entire unit had received the message. When Megan entered the locker room, conversations died mid-sentence. Colleagues pressed themselves against the lockers like frightened animals making room for a predator. Nobody spoke to her. Nobody made eye contact. The whisper started the moment her footsteps echoed down the corridor toward the stairs. Thursday morning brought the write-up. Posted on the unit board in administrative red ink, a document that might as well have been a scarlet letter in 2024, disciplinary action, Nurse M. The Bryan. Insubordination. Failure to follow chain of command. Unauthorized access to restricted patient files. Pierce had signed it with a flourish that looked like a signature carved into granite. The memo below read, setting an example for clinical standards and professional conduct. The break room emptied the moment Megan appeared for her shift. The nursing station became a cold shoulder turned collective. Orders came through the charge nurse now instead of direct communication. Her lunch was left on the counter, then thrown away, untouched, the message clear as words written in blood, you don't belong here anymore. That evening, she found her locker scratched. Clipboard, gouged into the metal in angry letters that looked like they'd been carved with something sharp. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the damage, not her locker, but her dignity being systematically dismantled in full view of everyone. Her right hand rose to the ring on her finger. She touched it the way some people touch crosses or dog tags in moments of fracture. Then she closed the locker and returned to work. Colonel Morrison was sleeping when she checked his vitals at 1900 hours. His wife and daughter had finally left for the evening, exhausted from watching their family members' slow recovery. The wound site looked wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, not yet, but wrong enough that Megan recognized the signs. The inflammation around the incision had that particular character of compromised materials beginning their slow, systemic failure. She'd seen it before in field dressing done with substandard supplies in Kandahar, in forward operating bases where the good equipment never arrived and the soldiers suffered the consequences weeks later. Morrison's sutures should have dissolved by now, should have been replaced by the body's own healing response. Instead, they sat there like foreign objects the body was slowly, desperately trying to wall off. She photographed the incision with her personal phone. 2 angles. Clinical lighting. Then she cross-referenced his surgical notes against the equipment requisition logs in the supply database. The pattern emerged like a photograph developing in chemical baths. Pierce had ordered surgical-grade absorbable sutures for Morrison's chest wound repair, the kind listed in the billing records at $847 per package. But the actual supply requisition showed something different: economy-grade non-absorbable polypropylene. The cost difference was $620 per unit. Across the surgical repairs Pierce had performed on military patients over the past 18 months, that difference compounded into numbers that made her jaw tighten. The mesh was worse. Hospital records showed titanium-reinforced surgical mesh, $2,100 per implant, perfect for contaminated or high-stress wound sites. The actual supply chain showed polypropylene mesh at $340. 3 military patients. 6 implants. The fraud wasn't accidental variance. It was systematic. Intentional. A businessman's calculation disguised as a surgeon's judgment call. She worked in the break room at 0530, when the hospital existed in that strange pre-dawn quiet where fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hymn and the building felt like a tomb. Her hands were steady as she photographed pages. The ring on her right hand clicked softly against the ceramic of her coffee mug, a sound so small it almost didn't exist, but enough to ground her in the present moment instead of the rage building quietly in her chest like a storm system gathering over water. Morrison's recovery trajectory was all wrong. His vitals stayed stable, yes, that was Pierce's competence showing through, his basic surgical skills never in question. But the slow inflammation, the delayed healing, the body's obvious struggle with materials it recognized as foreign and hostile, that was the consequence of cutting corners. When Megan mentioned it to the attending physician, a woman named Dr. Holloway who had no stake in Pierce's world, Holloway had only shrugged. Pierce says it's normal variance after field injuries. She didn't know that normal variance in combat medicine meant something entirely different, that Morrison's wound was screaming in a language only someone who'd done emergency battlefield surgery could translate. But that wasn't the worst part. That afternoon, Pierce found her outside the supply room, his face arranged into the expression of a man about to deliver a strategic blow. "I've noticed you've been very interested in the Colonel's case," he said, his voice smooth as silk over steel. "Patient continuity concerns. I'm reassigning you to orthopedics effective Monday." He smiled. The smile was the most dangerous thing about him. "We'll find you better suited elsewhere." Megan met his eyes. "The Colonel specifically requested me." It wasn't a lie. Morrison had asked for her by name exactly twice, once after his pain medication, once when he'd woken confused. But Pierce wouldn't know that. "The Colonel is medicated and confused," Pierce said, and turned to walk away. "Monday. Orthopedics. Don't be late." He was isolating her. Strategic. Calculated. Moving pieces on a chessboard with the precision of someone who'd done this before, who understood institutional power the way mechanics understand engines. She had 72 hours before she'd be pulled from Morrison's care, 72 hours before her access to his medical records would be restricted, 72 hours before whatever sabotage Pierce was planning would reach its final stage. Megan stood in the supply room doorway, watching Pierce disappear around the corner. Her right hand rose to her ring again. Just a small touch. A reminder of who she actually was when the scrubs came off. Then she returned to work, her face perfectly composed, her mind already calculating what needed to happen in the time she had left. Megan arrived 30 minutes early on Thursday, the hospital still dark except for the night shift glow seeping from the ICU. The orthopedics unit was a ghost floor at 5:11 a.m., just the skeleton crew restocking crash carts and running labs. She'd been doing this for 3 days now, slipping into the medical records room with a borrowed access badge, cross-referencing Morrison's surgical notes against the equipment logs and billing records that lived in the hospital's Byzantine database system. The fluorescent lights hummed their low constant song as she photographed Morrison's original operative report from his first admission. The handwriting was Pierce's, precise, arrogant, almost calligraphic. Repair of left anterior thoracic laceration, for to 0 absorbable sutures, placement of Jackson Pratt drain. The notation dated back 6 weeks. Simple. Clean on the surface. Surgical-grade materials, per the pre-op billing summary, $1,847 in suture materials alone. She pulled the equipment log for that OR. The inventory system was glacial, but it told a story if you knew how to read it. That particular OR had been supplied that morning with everything on the manifest, except the absorbable sutures had been requisitioned from the economical supply closet, not the surgical-grade cabinet. The switch had happened in the 5 minutes between Pierce's verbal order and the actual supply delivery. The difference in cost per spool was $340. Pierce had billed for the premium material and pocketed the remainder. One procedure. One patient. And Megan had found 7 more like it in Morrison's chart alone. She photographed page after page, her hands moving with mechanical precision. Military training made her efficient at documentation, record everything, trust nothing to memory, assume you'll need to testify. The hospital's billing codes were organized like a ledger from a confidence game, charge for the gold standard repair, use the aluminum substitute, pocket the margin. Over 3 weeks of Morrison's care, the pattern was visible if you knew where to look. It was visible because she'd spent 18 months learning how to see corruption before it killed her soldiers. The door to the medical records room opened without warning. Megan didn't flinch. She turned, camera still in her hands, and found herself staring at the charge nurse from the day shift, Rodriguez, mid-50s, the kind of woman who'd worked 17 years at St. Michael's and had learned not to make waves. Rodriguez didn't make eye contact. You need to log out. I'm authorized to be here. Megan's voice was quiet, neutral. Your access to Morrison's records was revoked. Rodriguez still wouldn't look at her. IT flagged it last night. Pierce submitted a request. Said you'd been accessing restricted billing files without authorization. The security office approved the restriction this morning. The room temperature didn't change. Megan's pulse didn't accelerate. These were just data points, like reading a tactical map before the mission briefing. When? 2 a.m. Your clearance expired automatically. There it was. Pierce hadn't waited. The previous afternoon's humiliation in front of Morrison's family had been the opening move, establish that Megan was insubordinate, establish witnesses, create a narrative. Now this, revoke her access to records, isolate her from the patient's medical data, cut off her ability to see what he was doing. Strategic. Surgical, even. Pierce was no longer just bullying. He was neutralizing the threat systematically. Thank you for telling me, Megan said. She closed the camera and set it on the desk. Rodriguez retreated, relief visible only in the slight relaxation of her shoulders. Megan walked out of St. Michael's at 6:14 a.m. and sat in her truck in the parking lot. The November sun was still 40 minutes from rising. She called the Pentagon liaison whose number was encrypted in her secure phone, the phone that wasn't in the hospital, the phone that lived in a locked box in her apartment along with the faded unit patch sewn into her jacket lining, the physical proof of Captain O'Brien's actual existence. Voicemail. Special Operations Command, 5:53 a.m. Pacific Time. Nobody was awake yet except the duty officer, and the duty officer wouldn't answer calls from field operatives requesting immediate debrief. She had until shift change to figure out what Pierce was planning. At 10:13 a.m., Morrison's OR schedule changed. A new entry appeared, drainage revision procedure, preoperative assessment 1 p.m., scheduled intervention 2:36 p.m. under Dr. Pierce's direction. Routine follow-up. No medical justification documented. Megan pulled the original operative notes from her apartment. She'd photographed everything before her access was revoked, and read through the surgical findings again. No indication for revision. No documentation of problems. Morrison's drainage output had been within normal range. His wound healing was proceeding as expected. There was no medical reason to go back in. There was, however, every financial reason. Pierce was going to open that wound, remove the economical sutures she'd seen in the inventory logs, replace them with the premium materials he'd billed for, document the findings as unexpected inflammation requiring intervention, and create a false surgical narrative that explained why the better materials were in the chest. He was going back in to erase evidence. Megan used the badge she'd borrowed from the orthopedics nurse, Thompson, day shift, who'd been friendly and hadn't asked too many questions when Megan mentioned she'd forgotten hers in the locker. The borrowed badge was laminated plastic and trust, a universal hospital currency. Nobody stopped her in the corridor. Nobody questioned her presence in the surgical wing. The observation gallery above OR4 was accessed from a maintenance stairwell. Nobody used these galleries anymore. They belonged to an older era of medical training when students watched from above instead of standing in the OR itself. The glass was dusty, the light filtered through decades of accumulated residue that made everything below seem underwater, dreamlike. Pierce was already scrubbed. His movements were the same as they always were, methodical, controlled, the kind of precision that came from someone who'd performed procedures thousands of times. His team was assembled, 2 nurses, an anesthesiologist. Morrison prepped and draped and unconscious beneath the overhead lights. The monitors beeped their rhythmic reassurance. O2 at 98%. Heart rate 67. Blood pressure stable. A man's life reduced to numbers on a screen. Pierce made his initial incision with a size 15 scalpel blade, and Megan watched him enter the thoracic cavity with the confidence of a man who believed he was completely alone, completely unobserved, completely safe in his fraud. He worked for 14 minutes. She timed him. He located the existing sutures, those cheap, non-absorbable ones that had no business being inside a decorated officer's chest, and began removing them with surgical precision. Each one came out carefully. He bagged them. He narrated his findings to the surgical tech: significant inflammation consistent with foreign body response, likely due to inadequate wound care or infection. Revised closure required. A lie being documented in real time. A false record being created at this very moment. Pierce reached for his suture kit. The premium materials. The 4-0 absorbable sutures that should have been there from the beginning. He was going to stitch the truth back into place and let the false history stand. That was when he looked up. The observation gallery was elevated, separated from the OR by glass and distance and the particular isolation of surgical suites. But Pierce looked up at exactly the wrong moment, and his eyes found Megan's in the shadows above. His hands froze mid-motion. The suture needle hung suspended between his gloved fingers. His face went white. Then red. Then something else entirely, the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse in the space of a single glance. He set the needle down. Slowly. His hands were trembling in a way that had nothing to do with fatigue. He didn't look at Megan again. He completed the closure in absolute silence, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles visibly worked beneath his skin, and he documented nothing more. No false findings. No medical narrative. Just the closure, the drain placement, the counts verified, the patient prepped for recovery. He knew. He knew she'd seen it. He knew she had evidence now, not just suspicion, not just financial pattern matching, but actual observation of him destroying evidence and creating fraudulent medical records in a federal hospital treating a decorated military officer. The intercom crackled. Security to OR4. We have a code. Megan was already moving, already back down the maintenance stairwell, already calculating the shortest path out. But the hospital's security office didn't respond to random codes. They responded to directives from attending physicians. The code wasn't medical. It was personal. She made it to the 3rd floor before the security detail found her. 2 officers in grey uniforms, professional and apologetic, and she didn't run because running would confirm something that needed no confirmation at this point. We need you to come with us, Sm. The walk through the hospital felt longer than 8 months of being invisible. Now every nurse, every doctor, every ancillary staff member turned to look. The secret was over. Captain O'Brien's cover, blown across a hospital full of witnesses who would remember the woman in scrubs being escorted out by security on a Thursday afternoon at 2:08 p.m. Her locker was already open when they reached the break room. Someone, probably Rodriguez again, following orders from above, had packed everything into a cardboard box. Her name badge. The coffee mug with a faded logo from a Veterans Day 5K. A dying succulent she'd tried to keep alive on the windowsill. The photograph she kept tucked in the back, the one nobody was supposed to see, her son in marine dress blues, the reason she'd taken this assignment in the first place, the reason she'd risked everything. They gave her the box without ceremony. The security officer didn't say goodbye. He just waited until she was gone, until the parking lot doors closed behind her and she was nobody again, just another fired healthcare worker with a box full of personal items and nowhere to go. Megan sat in her truck in the rain and didn't cry. The trembling in her hands wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind of control that comes from having already survived the worst, from having held dying soldiers in desert tents and made decisions that killed some to save others. Losing her position at St. Michael's was nothing. Losing her ability to protect Morrison was everything. She called the Pentagon contact again. Same voicemail. But this time she left a message, her voice calm and precise, Angel 6, contact compromised. Primary asset in danger. Recommend immediate extraction protocols. Call me back within the hour. The rain hammered her windshield like applause for a performance nobody was supposed to see. The rain hammered against her windshield like applause for a performance nobody was supposed to see. Megan sat in her car 3 blocks from St. Michael's, hands still trembling from the adrenaline of being escorted out, the weight of exposure pressing down like a physical thing. She'd blown the assignment. Pierce had made his calls, she could feel the network activating, spreading like oil on water. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Captain O'Brien? A voice she didn't recognize, clipped and military. This is Petty Officer Graves, Morrison's security detail. You need to get back here. Now. I've been removed from. Not as a nurse. As a soldier. The line went dead. She was moving before her rational mind caught up, abandoning the cardboard box on the bus stop bench, the cracked coffee mug, the dying succulent, the photo of her son in dress uniform still visible through the rain-soaked cardboard. Her jacket lining had torn when security dragged her out, exposing the faded unit patch she'd sewn inside years ago. She didn't button the jacket. She ran. The ICU alarm screamed like something dying. Not the rhythmic beep of a standard monitor, this was the wail of a trauma code, the sound that meant a human body was breaking down in real time. Megan burst through the ICU doors and saw it immediately, Morrison's room, every light blazing, nurses moving but without the coordinated precision of a practiced code. Someone was calling for Dr. Pierce. No one was in charge. The attending physician, a young woman named Reeves, stood frozen beside the bed, her hands at her sides, watching Morrison's oxygen saturation plummet on the monitor. 68, 64, 59. Morrison's chest wound was open. Not surgically, catastrophically. Blood soaked the dressing, the sheets, pooled on the linoleum floor in a spreading dark island. His blood pressure was 70 over nothing, dropping with each heartbeat. The cheap non-absorbable sutures that Pierce had used instead of the surgical-grade materials he'd billed for had failed. Completely. The wound had ruptured from the inside, tearing open like a seam under pressure it was never meant to withstand. Megan didn't think. She moved. Step back. Her voice had dropped an octave, the timid nurse completely gone. The authority in those 2 words made Graves, the young Marine corporal, actually move without questioning. She grabbed a scalpel kit from the crash cart, hands moving like they belonged to someone else, muscle memory from a field hospital in Kandahar taking over. Tent. No light except the chemical glow sticks. Hand shaking from cold and adrenaline and the knowledge that if she made one mistake, the soldier in front of her would die before she could save him. This was different. The ICU had proper lighting, proper equipment, a full surgical tray. This should be easier. It wasn't. Because she was doing this in front of witnesses who would remember every detail, every unauthorized movement, every piece of evidence that a nurse had just committed a felony by performing emergency surgery without authorization. Someone get me a level 1 rapid infuser. Now. Not a request. A command. A nurse she didn't recognize moved to comply. Good. The hiss of air escaping from the punctured chest cavity filled the room like a held breath finally released. Morrison's lung had collapsed inward, the tissue around the failed suture line hemorrhaging into the pleural space. She could see exactly what Pierce had done, used inferior materials, cut corners, documented false expenses. All of it sitting there in blood and failing tissue. She worked with the speed of someone who had held dying soldiers on stretchers under fire, who had stitched wounds in the dark, who understood that hesitation was the same as surrender. The scalpel moved with surgical precision along the thoracotomy line, opening the chest wall in the anterolateral approach, her hand steady as a surgical laser as she exposed Morrison's left lung. Blood filled the cavity like a dark tide. She clamped the bleeding with a satin sky clamp, her movements automatic, practiced, perfect. The non-absorbable sutures sat exposed, cheap material never meant for permanent closure on something as critical as a main vessel. She removed them with the same care a bomb tech uses to defuse explosives, aware that every movement was being photographed by security cameras, witnessed by staff members whose testimony would destroy her. O2 sat climbing, Reeves whispered. 64, 72. 78. The bleeding stopped. Megan placed the failed sutures in a specimen tray with the deliberate care of someone placing evidence at a crime scene. Morrison's vitals stabilized. His heart rate dropped from the tachycardic 142 down to a steady 88. Sinus rhythm. The crisis was over. The damage was done. Not the medical damage. Morrison would survive. The damage was institutional. Systematic. The kind that couldn't be sutured or clamped because it had infected the entire structure of the hospital from the inside out. Dr. Pierce arrived 7 minutes later, taking in the scene with a single sweep of his eyes. The open chest. The exposed non-absorbable sutures in the specimen tray. Megan standing over his patient, covered in blood, completely calm. The attending physician backing away slowly. Security already moving toward Megan with purpose. Pierce's face went white, then red, then something in between, a color that suggested internal systems failing. "Get her out of my hospital," he said, his voice like gravel. "Now. Remove her. Call the police if she resists. This is assault. This is battery. This is the end of her career." Megan didn't resist. She walked out with the same composure she'd walked in with, her hands still steady, her breathing normal, her military ring catching the fluorescent light as security placed it on her arm. Behind her, Pierce stared at the specimen tray, understanding exactly what she'd done. She'd saved his patient's life using his own incompetence as evidence. She'd exposed his fraud in real time, in front of witnesses, in a way that no audit could match. And he couldn't do anything about it except watch her leave. By Thursday morning, the paperwork was complete. Immediate termination for an authorized practice of medicine. Grounds for criminal charges pending investigation. Security escort from the property at 6:48 a.m., the sun not quite up, the parking lot still wet from overnight rain. Megan carried a box of personal items, a cracked coffee mug she'd bought at the gift shop, a plant someone had given her that she'd forgotten to water, a photo of her son in dress uniform. The box was deteriorating from the rain, cardboard softening into papier-mâché, the photo beginning to bleed at the edges. She stood at a bus stop 3 blocks away, holding the box, waiting for a bus that would take her anywhere but here. The rain started again, harder this time, the kind of rain that suggested the sky was tired of holding back. A passing car splashed through a puddle and soaked her shoes. Nobody recognized her. Nobody cared. She was just another unemployed woman in scrubs, standing in the rain with a cardboard box, watching her life dissolve into water and paper fiber. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from a blocked number, "Morrison's asking for you. Room for 12. The door is open." She didn't board the bus when it arrived. She ran back toward the hospital instead, rain streaming off her face like tears she would never actually cry. Her jacket lining tore further as she moved, the faded Special Forces unit patch exposed completely now, visible to anyone who looked. She didn't care anymore. The mission was compromised. The cover was blown. All that remained was the soldier. Morrison was conscious when she reached his room. Pale. Weak. But his eyes tracked her immediately, and something in his expression suggested he understood exactly what she'd done, even if he couldn't remember it. The monitor beside his bed showed perfect rhythm, perfect numbers, perfect recovery. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough but clear. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Speaking would require explaining, and there were no explanations left to give. Instead, she simply stood there in the rain-soaked scrubs with her exposed unit patch, watching a patient she'd saved, knowing that the cost of that salvation had been everything she'd built. The military ring on her right hand caught the overhead light, catching it and holding it the way it had held her identity for 8 months, visible only to those who knew how to see it. And then the intercom crackled to life with a voice that changed everything. Monday morning arrived like a verdict. Megan sat outside the hospital administrator's office on a plastic chair that creaked when she shifted her weight, cardboard box balanced on her lap, the same box from the rain-soaked bus stop, now held together with duct tape and regret. Her jacket hung open. The lining had split during the night, and there it was, the faded unit patch sewn inside the fabric, visible to anyone who looked. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. 8 months of invisibility undone by wet cardboard and a single seam giving way. She didn't reach to hide it. The patch had already done its work. From Morrison's room down the corridor came a sound that stopped the hallway cold. A man's voice, hoarse from tubes and time, repeating a single word over and over like a prayer: "Valkyrie. Valkyrie. Valkyrie." The nurses looked at each other. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. But the colonel kept calling, kept reaching for something just beyond the edge of consciousness, and Megan's hands went still on the box's edge. She knew that call sign. She'd earned it in the Hindu Kush 5 years ago, leading 12 wounded soldiers out of an ambush in the Sanjan Valley while rounds snapped overhead like angry insects. 1 silver star. 2 purple hearts. A name given by men who'd watched her pull bodies from burning hums. Valkyrie, the chooser of the slain, the one who decides who lives and who doesn't. A young Marine corporal stood outside Morrison's door, and he heard it too. His face shifted, confusion giving way to recognition, the way water gives way to a stone. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands, scrolling with the precision of someone searching for proof of a ghost, and then he started reading. His voice was thin, formal, the way voices get when they're speaking something sacred. Captain Megan O'Brien, Silver Star Citation, Helmand Province, June 2019, for extraordinary heroism under fire. Evacuated 12 wounded personnel across open terrain during active enemy engagement. Refused medical evacuation despite 2 gunshot wounds. Coordinated fire support while performing emergency first aid. Actions directly resulted in 12 Marines returning to their families. He looked up from the screen. His eyes found hers. "That's you." It wasn't a question. The moment stretched like taffy, thin and elastic. Megan didn't move. The box sat on her lap. The patch remained visible, no longer hidden, no longer carrying the weight of her entire operation. And then the elevator chimed. A general walked through those doors like the air itself was obligated to part. 2 stars on his shoulder, dress uniform crisp enough to cut, and his eyes, pale blue, sharp as a surgical blade, scanned the hallway with the automatic precision of someone trained to assess threats and assets in seconds. His gaze landed on the torn jacket, on the exposed patch, and something in his posture changed. The shoulders straightened. His hand came up. A salute, slow and deliberate, the kind you give to superior officers or the dead. Captain O'Brien. Not a request for confirmation. A statement of fact, delivered with the weight of rank. Megan stood. The box dropped to the chair. When she returned the salute, her hand moved like it had never forgotten, which it hadn't. Muscle memory didn't exist for things you never actually stopped doing. Behind the general, emerging from the stairwell with the chaotic energy of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time, came Dr. Pierce. His face was the color of old pennies. "What is the meaning of this? Why is that fired nurse in my hospital? She has no authorization to be here. I don't care if she's wearing—" He stopped. The general turned. The two stars on the shoulder caught the fluorescent light like weapons. Pierce's voice died in his throat the way small fires die when water hits them. "Doctor." The general's tone had the texture of a bullet being chambered. "I'm General Marcus Halloway, Joint Special Operations Medical Review Board. This is Captain O'Brien's undercover placement, sanctioned at the Pentagon level. And we have a problem with your facility." What happened next came in layers, each one peeling the skin off Pierce's carefully constructed life. Two Pentagon investigators emerged from the stairwell behind the general, carrying folders thick enough to require both hands. They didn't look angry. They looked methodical, which was worse. They laid out invoices on a medical cart, the kind used to wheel medications down hallways, now turned into a display table for a man's unraveling. Supplier receipts showing economy-grade sutures purchased at $47 per case. Medicare claims submitted for surgical-grade materials billed at $320 per case. Bank records showing quarterly deposits from MedCorp Solutions, the primary supplier, exactly 12 hours after each billing submission. 3 years, one investigator said, not looking at Pierce, just reading from a document as if the man wasn't there. 12 other patients. 18 separate billing violations. $2.3 million. Pierce's mouth opened. Nothing came out. The hallway had gone silent the way operating theaters go silent when a monitor flatlines, not peaceful silence, but the silence of something critical failing. A nurse wheeling a medication cart paused. A resident pretended to check her pager. Everyone within earshot suddenly had somewhere else to be, or nowhere to go at all. "Your medical license is suspended pending criminal investigation," the investigator continued. "Your practice privileges at this facility are revoked effective immediately. The FBI is seizing your financial records. You have the right to an attorney." What struck Megan, watching from 3 feet away with the general still standing beside her like a monument to a world Pierce had never actually believed existed, was how small he became. How the arrogance that had made him call her clipboard, that had made him dress her down in front of a colonel's family, that had made him believe his network of kickbacks and board connections could erase a decorated soldier from existence, how all of that drained from his face like blood from a severed artery. He looked at Megan once. Just once. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. In that moment, she didn't see malice or fear. She saw a man watching his entire life convert into evidence bags and criminal charges. "I want my attorney," Pierce whispered. "Noted," the investigator said. The general turned to Megan. "Your placement is concluded. Thank you for your service, Captain. St. Michael's administration is being notified that 3 additional veterans were treated here using compromised materials. Recovery protocol is being initiated." He paused. The corners of his mouth tightened slightly. "Your son would have been proud." She didn't respond. Some moments don't require words. 6 months dissolved like the foam on coffee you forget to drink. Megan received her commendation in a Pentagon office that smelled like old leather and furniture polish, a formal ceremony with exactly 4 people present, none of them here to photograph it for Instagram or hospital newsletters. Captain Megan O'Brien, for extraordinary heroism in exposing a fraud ring that endangered recovering military personnel. Morrison made his full recovery. The surgical reconstruction using proper materials took 3 months, but by the end of it, his chest wound was sealed with the same precision that could hold together anything human. He was reassigned to active duty. The Marine corporal who'd read her citation to the hallway wrote her a letter. "Because of you, he gets to go home to his family." Megan received it on a Tuesday and folded it into the photograph of her son that had been sitting in that cracked box. Teresa from the day shift sent a text, "I'm sorry." Megan didn't respond, not because she was angry but because some apologies are meant to be carried by the people who offer them, not collected by those who receive them. The hospital administrator offered her a position. Permanent. Salaried. With a written apology framed in mahogany. She declined. She was already reassigned to active duty, already assigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment's medical support team, already preparing for a new rotation that would take her places where the work didn't require her to pretend to be unremarkable. On her last day at St. Michael's, she walked past the supply room where Pierce had cornered her. The space was empty except for boxes of gloves stacked like bricks. She walked past the break room where colleagues had abandoned their coffee and their solidarity. Just a room with a refrigerator now, humming its oblivious tune. She walked past the unit board where her name had been written in disciplinary ink. Someone had scrubbed the board clean. The spaces were just spaces, emptied of the power she'd given them by caring what they meant. At Fort Sam Houston, on a Saturday morning 6 months later, the parade ground shimmered under Texas heat that felt like judgment. Lieutenant Marcus O'Brien stood in dress uniform, receiving his posthumous promotion to captain, the rank he would have held if the IED in the Hindu Kush had given him the chance. Colonel Morrison, fully healed, fully returned to active duty, pinned the insignia while Megan stood in dress uniform, her simple military ring catching the sunlight like it had caught the light in hospital hallways and parking lots and bus stops. When Morrison saluted her after the ceremony, his hand rose with the precision of a man practicing gratitude. She shook her head slightly. "Your son saved my life in Sanjin," Morrison said. "You saved it here." "We're family, sir," Megan replied. Across town, in a strip mall squeezed between a dollar store and a nail salon like an afterthought, Dr. Pierce stood in front of 18 community college students, teaching CPR certification for minimum wage. His medical license was permanently revoked. His practice was gone. His reputation was a court record. He demonstrated chest compressions on a plastic dummy while students scrolled through their phones, indifferent to the man in front of them, and he was fine with that indifference because it was all he deserved. He was teaching the skill of revival to people who would never know he'd destroyed lives in pursuit of billing codes. A young specialist approached Megan at the ceremony, hesitant. "I heard what you did at St. Michael's. How you knew when to break cover when the risk to the patient was worse than exposure." Megan considered the question. She turned the ring on her right hand, the simple band that had been there all along, visible to anyone who knew how to see it, invisible to everyone who didn't. "Power is not a title," she said quietly. "Power is the ability to help." Morrison, standing 2 paces away, nodded. He understood exactly what she meant. The formation dismissed. Megan walked toward the parking lot where her son's photograph sat on her dashboard, no longer in a cracked box at a rain-soaked bus stop, but honored, home, and restored to the rank he'd earned. The ring on her right hand caught the Texas sunlight one final time as she saluted the flag and walked toward whatever came next. If you've watched this far, you know there are quiet warriors walking among us, people who carry impossible loads with a kind of grace that makes it look easy. Subscribe to see more stories like Megan's, and tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value?